Well, hello and welcome to another video by Financial Learning. On today's video, we're going to take a look at CleanSpark Inc.'s estimated quarter-ending revenue. We're also going to look at the potential amount of cash they have on hand. I did take some liberties on some of these calculations. None of this is financial advice. This is just my best estimate. So without further ado, let's get right into it. All right, and before we get into the estimated revenue, I did want to share how I came up with some of these calculations. As I mentioned, this is just my best guess based off of some public information off of previous earnings, and then I took the liberties to average out some of the hash rates, some of the monthly efficiency numbers, and the overall cost to mine this Bitcoin from an energy and a depreciation standpoint. So first thing I want to draw your attention to is going to be that yellow column. These are going to be the estimates for this Q2 earnings report. I have the average global hash rate for the January to March quarter coming in at 795 exahash per second. And that is about an 11.45% increase compared to just one quarter ago in terms of global hash rate. We have been seeing this hash rate continue to increase. In fact, in the month of April, it did hit some all-time highs up to above 1 sextillion, which is over 1,000 exahash per second. Taking a look at the next one, this is going to be CleanSpark's estimated quarterly hash rate. So I took CleanSpark's 3 different press releases for their monthly mining numbers, and I averaged out the hash rate as well as the efficiency. And I do have that boxed here in this table. You can see here, January was 16.15 joules per terahash, February came in at 17.07, and March was 17.03 joules per terahash. So that's an average of 16.75. And then looking at that global hash rate, on this one, again, I took the average of each of these months. This was just based off of some of the moving average information I could find. And I have the overall quarter global hash rate coming in at 795. I'm also averaging CleanSpark's quarter hash rate to come in at 41 exahash per second. With all that information, that does leave CleanSpark with a quarter average of about 5.2% of the overall network hash rate. And taking a look at this Bitcoin mining calculator, you can actually see with a couple inputs such as the blocks per hour, the network hash rate, the block reward, some transaction fees, fleet efficiency, and the power cost, I'm able to get an estimate of what that energy to mine Bitcoin would come in at. So again, looking at around 84,000 per Bitcoin, and this doesn't have to do with the cost to mine the Bitcoin, but rather the profit margin number. I'm using that here for this calculation. The network hash rate, this is important in terms of what that energy to mine each Bitcoin would come in at, and the overall fleet efficiency. So you can see I do have that 795 exahash per second for global hash rate, and I have this 16.75, which is what I believe CleanSpark will use in their fleet efficiency for the average of the entire quarter. And CleanSpark did share in their last quarterly earnings report what that power cost was, so I'm using that in this calculation as well, and that came in at $0.049. And then with all that information being added in, you can see that the energy cost actually went down a little bit compared to last quarter, and it's sitting at $33,786. And as I mentioned, I'm taking a lot of averages here, so I will be interested to see if these numbers are somewhat close to what CleanSpark discloses, and I am expecting that quarterly earnings report to be coming out sometime in the early to mid-May. So with all that information, let's jump back into this yellow column here. Again, you can see the overall fleet. I have this number here, and this would be the average number of miners that they disclose for January, February, and March. I have that number because that's important when you're calculating the depreciation. But moving down, you can see I do have that $33,786 put into the calculation, and that gives the energy expense total for the entire quarter at $66,085,000. And that is because they mined a total of 1,956 Bitcoin in the first calendar quarter here. This will be their fiscal quarter 2. And looking at the miner depreciation, I have that coming in at $34,361 per Bitcoin. And moving back up to the depreciation expense total, you can see that's $67,210,056. So almost neck and neck between the depreciation and the energy expense. And how am I coming up with that depreciation number? Let's take a look at that other yellow column. You can see I have the S21 and S21 Pro cost, and I also have the S21 XP immersion cost. Now, where I came up with the cost per miner is going to be based off of some of their previous disclosures they had in some of their other earnings reports, where they listed the total amount of miners of each of these different types and the cost they were paying for those miners. So taking all of that into account, that's where I got the cost. And then I'm taking the liberty to estimate that they have about 80% of their overall fleet has the S21 and S21 Pro, and then about 20% of the fleet would be that S21 XP immersion miner. These percentages could be off, which would impact the depreciation amount, but regardless, this is just the estimate I came up with. So you can see the depreciation per quarter came in at $67,210,055. All right, so with all that, let's jump up and discuss the quarter ending earnings. All right, and let's jump into the estimated quarterly earnings for CleanSpark. You can see here I have the estimated revenue for mining Bitcoin coming in at $182,107,000. And this number is calculated based off the total amount of Bitcoin mined and the monthly average for the price of Bitcoin. So you can find a lot of that information by looking at their public wallet. Some months they do disclose the average price that they mine the Bitcoin at, but in case they don't have that on one of their monthly updates, you can definitely look at that wallet address and get an idea about what that daily price is when they mine that Bitcoin. So moving on, you can see the next item is going to be that cost of revenue. This is going to be that non-depreciated cost that comes in at $66,085,000. Next line after that is going to be their professional fees. You can see I'm just copying the professional fees from the previous earnings report, came in at $3,885,000. So when looking at payroll, I didn't add any additional heads, just gave a cost of living increase. And that's because if you've been listening to some of the fireside chats with Matthew Schultz or with Gary or even with Zach, you would have heard them talk a little bit about how as they're increasing the additional miners, they're not increasing the head count. And that is because they are using telematics and other ways to remotely monitor these Bitcoin miners. So you don't need as many individuals doing a lot of that heavy maintenance and troubleshooting because you have a lot of that available digitally. The other thing to note is that these immersion miners, they are also a very low maintenance ticket item once they are up and running. So moving on, you can see the next item is going to be that general and administrative expenses. Again, I left this flat at $10,054,000. And the last item, this is going to be the gain or loss on fair value of Bitcoin. And I do have this little snippet right under there. But before I calculate that, just want to share it is $96,650,000. And this would be a loss compared to the previous quarter. And that is because the price of Bitcoin has changed. So at the end of last quarter, Bitcoin price was at $94,038 a Bitcoin. And at the quarter ending March 31st, Bitcoin price was at $84,326. So that's about a $9,710, $9,711 drop in terms of Bitcoin pricing. And then you want to multiply that by the total number of Bitcoin that they were holding at the start of the quarter, which gives them a total fair value loss on their Bitcoin holdings at $96,650,000. But before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about that. Obviously, we're here in middle of April and earnings will be sometime next month. But you can see, even though March 31st closed, there was no rush to reduce CleanSpark share price or anything of that nature. The institutions did hold tight. If not, they actually increased total number of shares if you're looking at it from a month-to-month basis. And that's because the price of Bitcoin is going to be very volatile. It is going to be moving around quite a bit. Even today, it's slightly higher than where it closed on March 31st. So what a lot of these institutions and other investors are looking at is operational excellence. How large are the company's profit margins? Are they continuing to scale operations to keep pace with the rest of the sector? Are they looking at ways to improve efficiencies? And we can see all of that with CleanSpark. So I believe that is why institutions have been increasing their share of CleanSpark. They do see the value that the overall organization is bringing to the table, and their treasury amount is significant now at over 12,000 Bitcoin. So they do have a very nice stake in terms of Bitcoin, and that does have a nice valuation close to $1 billion. So regardless of how the quarter starts and ends in terms of that Bitcoin pricing, to me, what the institutions and what the larger investors are looking at is, what do those margins look like? Are they able to pay for that month without needing to borrow additional money? And we're going to take a look at some of their cash flows in just a minute, and I'll give you my honest opinion on how I think the company is performing. And moving down the list, next thing to talk about is going to be depreciation. I already talked about that on the previous slide, but just want to show it again here in this earnings slide. So you can see here that it is $67,385,000, and that is the total number of Bitcoin mined in the quarter times that depreciation per Bitcoin. And again, these are just my estimates. So adding that to the other cost of operations, and again, depreciation is just a method that the company is using to be able to write off some of their tax burden. But it is very important that they keep a certain amount of the either cash on hand or the Bitcoin in their treasury, so that when it is time to refresh their fleet, they have plenty of liquidity, plenty of capital to be able to do that. And of course, with over $1 billion in Bitcoin capital, I think they're doing just fine. But moving further down, you can see total costs for the quarter was $265,140,000. So take that revenue number at the top, the 182,107, subtract this 265, and you're going to get a negative $83,030,000. So we'll take a look at the EPS now, and we'll look at some of the other smaller ticket items that would also be impacting this quarter. All right, jumping down a little bit further, you can see other income I have zeroed out. You can see change in fair value of their contingency considerations, as well as that Bitcoin collateral returned. They already had that Coinbase line of credit completely paid off to start this quarter. So there is no line items, at least to my knowledge, that would go in these categories. So the next would be that change in fair value of their Bitcoin collateral. And again, as I stated, they don't have that collateral, so I have that zeroed out for this quarter. And after that, you're going to see the realized gain on sale of equity securities, unrealized loss on equity securities. Just because prior months did not have these listed, I went ahead and just kept that status quo. Now, of course, I am just a public investor. I am not sure what the inner workings of the company are looking like. We could get surprised on some of these line items in the good or the bad. So it's going to be very interesting, and make sure you do take a look at some of these other line items to see if there's any surprises in this earnings report. And the next actual line item that I do have calculated out here is going to be that unrealized gain / loss on derivative securities. So again, I went ahead and took the last quarter of a gain on derivative securities. I just figured since the company was able to post a gain last quarter, they found a methodology in order to be able to get a little additional capital on their derivatives. So I went ahead and left this line item in here. The next is going to be the interest income. Again, I went ahead and used the same interest income as the previous quarter. And then the interest expense, you can see that line item there as well. And again, just using the same quarter to keep it easy, as I do not know those specific details. So looking at all of those, you're going to see the other income coming in at $3,539,000. And this is a positive in terms of income. All right, and that income / loss before income tax expenses, that's just going to be the summation of the other income item plus that cost of operations. So you can see that has it coming in at a negative $79,491,000. And the next item I have on here is going to be that income tax expense. And I went ahead and calculated this based off of that revenue that was generated for the quarter. And I have that expense coming in at $20,032,000. And of course, this is my estimate. It could be definitely off depending on how they're marking out some of the depreciation costs and what they are actually claiming of overall revenue, and also what that taxation amount is. So moving down a little bit further, we're going to go ahead and add that tax expense back to the total cost before income tax expense. And now you're going to get it back at that negative $99,520,000. So that's where I believe they are, just shy of $100 million in a loss of operations. And again, the majority of that loss has to do with that valuation of Bitcoin, HODL amount, getting reduced because of the drop in Bitcoin price from the start to finish of the quarter. All right, and the last section before I jump over and talk a little bit about cash flow is going to be some of the net income / loss that's attributable to shareholders, as well as that EPS. So starting at the top, you can see, again, it's at that negative $99,520,000. And then there is an other comprehensive income. I went ahead and brought forward what was already on the previous quarter earnings, and that is that $32,000 worth. So it doesn't really change it by much. And then the next thing I want to talk about is going to be that weighted average common share count. Again, this is the common shares outstanding. This does not include any of the insider owned shares. Those would be restricted shares. So I have the overall share count remaining flat for the quarter compared to last quarter. We did get the information from the company that did disclose that they have not diluted any shares in the form of an ATM offering or really any other type of equity offerings since the beginning of November. So I'm very happy as a current investor in CleanSpark that the company has made this decision to continue operations without tapping into any form of equity financing. And then looking at the EPS, again, with this specific share count, you can see it comes in at negative 35 cents. Now you will see that the analysts may have them at a slightly positive amount. I think the analysts are all over the place in terms of CleanSpark and these other Bitcoin mining companies. As you do know, a lot of them are using that fair value of Bitcoin in order to calculate their earnings and their EPS. So I'm not too concerned with that. In fact, if you think about it, as I mentioned earlier on, a lot of these large institutions, a lot of these investors, they're really looking at operational excellence. They're looking to see, is the company generating a profit month over month? And if they are, what other things are they doing to continue to move the company forward? How are they scaling their business? How are they making it more efficient to increase those profit margins? Those are the types of things that I believe large institutions are going to be looking at, especially when you're looking at a Bitcoin mining company like this. So a lot of other industries, I think the EPS is definitely important. And that's because you don't really have this fair valuation of a currency impacting the company. The company is really responsible for their cost of goods sold, their sales overall, their revenue numbers. There's not a large fluctuation in terms of dollar changes, if you will. So keep that in mind if you notice that a lot of other industries, they are impacted by the EPS that comes out in earnings. I just don't really see that for this specific industry. Could be wrong, but that's just my personal take. And then jumping down a little bit further, I did also look at this diluted amount of shares, and this would be the total number of shares if all of the current warrants and other forms of shares were actually exercised. There hasn't been any other forms of warrants or any other activities that occurred for CleanSpark this past quarter. So looking at that, that's 291,887,000 and change shares. And that has that diluted EPS coming in around negative 34 cents per share. Now let's take a look at that cash flow. I think that's really important as an investor. How's the company doing? How are they managing that cash? So I did take some liberties on some estimating, and I'd like to share that with you next. All right, now let's jump into some of the cash flow numbers. But before we do, first thing I want to show you, again, this is how I calculated some of the monthly averages for the revenue. So you can see each month there's the Bitcoin that was mined, and there's the monthly averages. And I did find these averages either by CleanSpark's public disclosures on their monthly press releases, or I was able to calculate it based off of some of the wallet information. So with all that being said, you can see there's January, February, March. I do have the total amount mined. And then you can also look at that previous Bitcoin amount that was being held prior to the quarter starting and the quarter ending HODL amount. So taking a look at all of that, let's break down some of this cash flow. So you can see here, quarter ending price of Bitcoin was $84,326. And looking at that cost again, this is the cost of revenue, excluding the depreciation. It was $66,085,000, as I already explained. And then you can also see that depreciation amount. We're going to be looking at cash starting at December 31st. It was $276,599,000. And looking at Bitcoin sales, on those monthly disclosures, they did speak a little bit about selling the Bitcoin and what the average sale price was. So I was able to calculate what the revenue was that they were able to generate on those Bitcoin sales. And it was $3,766,073. So you're able to add that to the December 31st cash in order to figure out some of the cash flow items. And then looking at that last earnings report, they also talked a little bit about some of the commitments and contingencies that they had open. There was a total of $82,848,000 in commitments and contingencies. And then they also disclosed one of the purchases for that Georgia location. It was a Twin City location. So they do have another infrastructure set up with some new Bitcoin miners that were added, did help out with some of the hash rate increases this past quarter. And that was a $5,400,000 purchase. So taking those expenses, also taking the cost of revenue, this would be just the energy cost, not including depreciation. That's at $66,085,000. And then also the cost of administration. This would be the payroll. This would be the professional fees. And this would be the G&A line items. All of those items added together. Again, I'm using last quarter's estimates. Plus for payroll, I did put a little bit more for cost of living increases. And that's at $34,808,000. So all that cash out leaves them with an end of quarter cash estimate at $91,223,657. But what did they add in terms of HODL value? So yeah, they used energy, but what did they get out of that? They got another $161,654,398 of Bitcoin value. And that is at that $84,326 amount. So again, if you add those two numbers up, that would be the cash for quarter end plus the HODL value that was added in the Bitcoin amount that you can convert to cash using that quarter ending amount. You get $252,878,056. So looking 276 minus 252, you're only looking at maybe about $24 million or so of a reduction of cash. But look what they did get. They got a massive amount of infrastructure added, $82 million of mining equipment, as well as some infrastructure and an entire location at that $5,400,000 amount. So I think that's a pretty good trade-off. Almost $90 million of asset purchases and only having a $20 million or so reduction in cash flow. So again, they're able to do all of that because CleanSpark is profitable on a month-to-month basis. And if you take out the depreciation amount, you can see they have plenty of cash still remaining on their balance sheet. With all that being said, looking at end of quarter HODL, it came in at $1,874,000. And the cash in HODL, so combining the remaining cash on hand with this HODL ending quarter amount, it's $1,092,097,972. So again, I think CleanSpark again finished another quarter with a very healthy balance sheet, a lot of cash and cash equivalents in the form of Bitcoin left on that balance sheet. So I think it was an excellent quarter. In my opinion, we saw some efficiency improvements. We saw some hash rate increases. We saw that energy costs go down because of the efficiencies. Yes, we saw some depreciation going up, but they're getting world-class miners added in, which is also helping keep that headcount down, as these are those immersion style miners. So a lot of positive things going in CleanSpark's favor. So that's my take on earnings. Love to hear your thoughts on this. Where did I come up short? Love to hear your thoughts. We'll have a couple weeks before CleanSpark puts out their estimates. So if you'd like to do some calculations and do some spot checks on me, love to get your thoughts on that. All right, and that about wraps it up for me. I hope you enjoyed this quick earnings estimate update for CleanSpark. This is going to be for that March ending quarter. We should hear news from them sometime in early to mid-May. But if you did like this video, consider giving it a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts. How off do you think, or how close do you think I am on this earnings estimate? Love to get that feedback from you all. And with all that said, hope you all have a great rest of your day. Keep calm, hash on, and we'll see you on the next one.